Hello, everyone. So today we have Christoph Noller. He's an ecologist and soil scientist. And today would be a very interesting discussion because this is a topic which I know very little about. So it's about heavy metals in soils and soil contamination by heavy metals. And welcome.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to your podcast. Yeah, I was really excited to be part of this project, and I'm happy to share everything I know as concise as possible. And I hope I can, share this knowledge with all your listeners.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I will just jump into the right questions. The first is, so you do your PhD in, you have done a lot of work in heavy metals, and also you know a lot about heavy metals in soils and the contaminated soils. So could you tell us a little bit about what are heavy metals?
Yeah, so I started to really work intensively with heavy metals in my master thesis, and now it also continued in my PhD. So I also had to think about the definition a lot. I had to write at least two main introductions to define heavy metals, and it's not even that easy if you want to do it in a scientific way, because you could also do it like if we have a casual conversation and someone says heavy metals, you instantly probably have a definition in mind, and that somehow or probably contains something like a metal, an element which is somehow harmful or toxic to us or the environment. And that actually maybe is not the worst definition after I did all this reading of the work of other scientists who also discussed that, because it is the definition question is a bit debated. Because you could also just define it without saying anything about toxicity. You can say it has to do something with the atomic mass or the periodic number. And that's also somehow why it's called heavy metals. It's the heavier metals, and they're also the light metals. So somehow this is how these words came up. But there are a lot of definitions, and the broadest one would cover around like 80% of all elements existing would be heavy metals. And that's somehow does not go well together with this more casual definition we have in our heads. So usually if you say heavy metals, or if you read about heavy metals, it's more, and if you have a periodic table next to you, it's more the transition metals we are talking about, like mercury, cadmium, chromium, copper, or metalloids like arsenic or antimony. And those are maybe also you heard about, and maybe you heard about they're like not that healthy, and they're all potentially toxic and also relate to ecotoxicity, so are harmful to life, animals in the environment.
I heard about arsenic. So the groundwater is usually contaminated by arsenic, and usually I just found out that my country has the highest arsenic contamination of the water. So that was very scary to just read that paper, because, when I drink the water, I just drink it. I never question it that there is some kind of heavy metals, but it explains a lot of things, because like I would have my relatives who would get sick, or like I would hear that my neighbors would get sick, but it makes totally sense. So could you also elaborate what might be the source of heavy metals?
So heavy metals, they usually occur in relatively low concentrations, but everywhere in the earth crust. And since you talked about arsenic, arsenic is a big problem when groundwater comes in contact with bedrock or minerals which are rich in arsenic. And this is especially true in all countries neighboring or even being close to the Himalaya regions, but also in other regions of the world. There are high contaminations in arsenic. So arsenic is mostly problematic because there is a natural pollution from rocks which just pollute the groundwater, and then we drink it. And this is highly toxic, especially because you take it up every day. It's a continuous long-term contamination of your body, and this is the most problematic thing. If you just have a one-time contamination, maybe you can even reverse it quite easily, but really constantly contaminating your body is, just really bad. And but I mean, usually natural pollution is not the main problem for most people, because really, really high contamination also happens, or often happens due to anthropogenic contamination. So we do some heavy industry, which is mostly located also in densely populated areas. And this leads to the contamination of a lot of people. And natural contamination is mostly, or can also be spread out. And if there's an area contaminated where nobody lives, then it's not that, not such a big problem compared to anthropogenic contamination.
Yes, probably here it's better to listen more about your experience. Like you said that also in your master's and on your PhD worked with heavy metal contaminations. Could you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, so actually in my master's, I also was working with in areas where there was a naturally high concentration in nickel, because the mineral in the region was also in Austria. It was relatively high. I mean, not as problematic. Also, nickel has not the same properties as arsenic. Does not leach that easily into the groundwater, and you don't. It's not that easy to contaminate yourself. But there I did work more on plants growing in the area, and maybe we can also talk more about that, like plants that actually take up a lot of nickel and maybe can be used for other.
Yes, we do. We will talk about it later. Yes, yeah. Exactly. So you worked in Austria?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This was in Carinthia, and also the other project now I'm working on my PhD is also in Carinthia, but this is an area which was heavily contaminated with lead and cadmium, especially because there were big lead and later zinc mining approaches, and without air filters at the time, the whole area was heavily polluted, and also the rivers. And the rivers then carried the contamination much further down the valley. And exactly. Yeah. And there, in both theses, I was investigating different ways to deal with that contamination.
Mm-hmm. So basically, the source could be different. As you said, it could be natural from the groundwater, also from the mining and agricultural lands as well. But I'm not sure. I'm not an expert, so I wouldn't guess.
No, I mean, in agriculture, I didn't work with that much, but there is, for example, in phosphate fertilizers, they are mainly mined in northern Africa, and they have a naturally high contamination with radioactive elements. Radioactive elements, I don't know which one at the moment, but they also have high concentrations in cadmium. So, I mean, it's not extremely high, but it accumulates. The problem with heavy metals and heavy metal contamination in soil is that soil is kind of made for sorbing all kinds of substances and keeping them for a longer time, also depending on the chemical composition. But still, if you add a heavy metal, it will stay there for ages. And since we are using fertilizers and won't stop using fertilizers for quite some time, we will accumulate, cadmium, for example, in our agricultural fields.
Okay, I see. But how it also can influence human body?
It depends really on how long you're exposed and how high the rate of, or
the concentration?
Yeah, the peak concentration is, but yeah, I mean, there are examples. I looked them out again for today. For example, they're very famous in Japan. For example, there was the itai-Itai disease, which comes from itai, which is just like ouch, means like ouch, ouch. And it came from
itai-Itai means ouch, ouch.
Yeah, so it's really hurt the people. It was a cadmium contamination it was a mining activity, and they just had their wastewater flushed into the river. And the people, due to fish and also just drinking the water, got heavily contaminated. It was in the early 20th century. And also there was the Minamata disease, which was caused by mercury contamination, especially of shellfish. And this was also a chemical company, and there were no regulations then, and they were just flushing it into the sea. And people, like, if they get contaminated for quite some time, they get problems with their bones, with the bone structure. This leads to immense pain. They get problems with their organs, the heart, kidney, sight, especially with mercury, blindness, increased cancer risk. So it's really not funny. Yeah. But usually like here, for example, a lot of people also worry due to contamination of their private gardens if they are located next to roads, for example. And yeah, I mean, it is a worry which you have to discuss, and people are not only wrong because until the 90s or even longer, there was anti-knocking agent in petrol. So the petrol is used more efficiently in the motor was used, and it was a lead compound. So lead was used for an anti-knocking agent, and it was distributed all along roads. And there are a lot of studies showing that especially children with increased lead concentrations in blood and bone had, were mentally not disabled, but set back by the contamination. And there's no lower limit for some heavy metals, which are not super toxic, but also essential. Maybe I can also talk about that more. Are like upper limits or lower limits. And for lead, it doesn't exist because it's so toxic. There's no healthy, no healthy concentration you can have in your blood. But for example, for other metals like zinc or manganese, those at high concentration can also be toxic, but are essential for humans and also for plants. Plants need them to grow and need them for metabolic processes.
Yes, I usually take as a vitamin iron.
Yeah.
But so any concentration of lead can influence our body in a bad way.
Yes.
It's very toxic. It can also reduce. It's fascinating to see that. I recently found out about arsenic in my country, right? You've been studying these heavy metals, which is pretty interesting for me. Like, how did you came up, or why did you find this topic interesting for your PhD and for your master's as well?
I started my master in Germany and came to Austria for half a year and studied here. And I was taking 2 classes with 2 professors. They had this research group at the BOKU, and I was really intrigued by their teaching. And they had also then when I did my master's in their group, the group was just interacting. It was a very comfortable or very cool group. Nice interactions, and it just felt right. And also the topic was super interesting because it's so you instantly see that you do something helpful. Like if you mitigate contamination, you can help people directly. It's not something. Also, everybody can understand it. Like when I talk to people and explain what I do, I don't have to do a lot of explaining. I mean, I can go into detail and get super complicated, but if I just tell them I try to mitigate pollution or remove heavy metals from soils, it's super easy to understand. And maybe that was also something where I thought this can have a direct impact on our lives. And that was super, was super attractive.
Yes. My friends usually make fun of me because I studied soil science, during my bachelor, and they would make fun of me. What do you do? Like, how you can study soil? It's just soil. But yours sounds very important, like heavy metals in soils. So yeah, I was just interested. So you said that you worked a lot with the contaminated soils by heavy metals. How do you know that the soil has a high content of heavy metals? Or do you see it by plants, or is there any way of knowing that the soil is contaminated?
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit difficult. Of course, at some point you will see that plants have problems in growing, and you see a color change or they're dying, and then you can think of what's the problem and you can start soil analysis. But yeah, maybe that's too late then. But yeah, I mean, today usually there is a lot of soil testing going on, just randomly, or if you have if you know something about the area. And in Austria, for example, there is a cataster, like a library for contaminated or potentially contaminated areas. And they started with areas where there was heavy industry going on, or other chemical industries. And so they assumed maybe there are some old contaminations, and they are going through those potential areas and testing them. So they have a good overview over the contaminated sites in Austria. But if you want to know more about your own soil in your private garden, for example, maybe you just should just check that. And there are a couple of commercial solutions. You could order like a soil testing box. There are some companies who offer that. Mm-hmm. And I think for heavy metals, it's between 50 and 100 euros or so, and you get the full range of common heavy metals, and you can check your own soil. But by just looking on it, it's super difficult, because concentrations which are problematic to us wouldn't be necessarily problematic for the plants. And yeah, but also I have to say, if you're just there and you're eating the vegetables, it shouldn't be such a big problem. You're not contaminating yourself a lot. It's more a problem if you really eat the soil or breathe in the dust, which happens when there are no plants, for example, or also children playing in the garden, and they eat a lot of soil. It's sometimes a bit unintuitive, but children eat a lot of soil, and they have also the biggest problems if they have higher contamination during their childhood. So yeah, you should really know that. But also for some sites, it's super strict and tested a lot, like playgrounds. So you will never find a playground which is contaminated, at least here in Austria.
It's not also expensive, 50 or 100 euros, right? For all the...
Yeah, you can make a mixed sample. And then the analysis is very fine. So if you find elevated values, you will know it's somewhere in your garden, and then you can test more specific for a specific region. Maybe you expect somewhere that there are some contaminated spots.
Mm-hmm. So let's imagine we found a soil which was contaminated, and now do we have any ways to recover the soils from heavy metals?
Yeah, it's a really big topic. There are a lot of ways to deal with those contaminated sites. As I said, with heavy metals, it's difficult because they accumulate and they won't decay. Like for organic pollutants, you could try to somehow destroy them with heat or with microorganisms, even decompose them, or you have more options. But with heavy metals, you either keep them in the soil and prevent them from spreading with the dust or leaching into the groundwater. You can only go for more extreme measures, So for example, you could either I first maybe talk about this stabilization, like keeping them in the soil, because for some soils maybe that's not the worst solution. Maybe you don't need this field for production of crops. Maybe it's just even in a I don't know if it's just an area like a national park or whatever. It's not that bad for it could be not that bad for the animals living there or for the whole ecosystem, but it could be bad if it goes into the groundwater. So maybe you want to monitor the soil and change the soil composition so you can prevent any leaching, and that you could do by applying different amendments like compost or biochar, or there are also industrial waste materials which have already been applied to such highly contaminated areas like iron sludge, but they also have some negative effects. So you also have to figure out which plants you can plant on top. So there is a plant cover which prevents erosion either by water or by wind. So this is also has to be holistic. For arsenic, there's also a big problem with the oxygen content. So there has to be enough air in the soil because arsenic is mostly mobile when it's reduced. So if there's not enough air in the soil, it will reduce and then it's mobile. So you also have to take care of that. But you could then, if that's not an option, if it's close to a settlement or close to a water reserve, you want to dig it out maybe. And that's like the conventional method. You just dig it out and you put it into a landfill and then you don't think about it anymore. And that's still done, quite widely. Yeah. So if you don't want to go for the dig and dump option, so excavating and dumping in the landfill, you can take the soil and wash it or separate it. So you can separate the more coarse texture materials like sand from the more fine materials like clay, because clay has sorbs most of the heavy metals. So if you remove the clay, you can keep the soil and the rest of the soil and put it back on where you removed it, and it's probably 80 to 90% of the metals removed. So this also would be an option. But you could also wash the soil and keep all of the comparts. But then you need some chemical solutions. You need chelating agents which mobilize the metals, bind them, and then you can extract the washing solution, and the soil is cleaned also around 80% from the metals. But then you have to get rid of those chemical compounds. There are some technologies which promise that, but they're still under development, and they're also super expensive. Also, the dig and dump approach is super expensive. But for some areas, high contamination, a lot of hazard to humans or the environment, maybe that could still be something considered. And the last thing, we talked about it already a bit, is using plants to extract metals from soil. This is mostly limited to soils which are not that heavily contaminated, but it's quite cheap, and the plants do the job for you. They take up the metals, you can harvest them, and sometimes in some areas, or if you have the right plant, you can even burn it and kind of harvest the ore from the burnt ash and also use it further for in industrial processes.
Mm-hmm. So I see there is no easy way of getting out the heavy metals from the soil, right?
No, sadly not. Yeah.
It's so complex. Also, if we are talking about more than 10 hectares, I'm just thinking also about the money, how much money would be spent to take the soil out and get out the clay and put it back. I mean, it's also somehow disturbs the soil profiles, right? Yeah,
it's super, it's disrupting the whole, like if you take it out and wash it and put it back in, the whole soil structure is destroyed. And also, actually, I'm working with such a technology in my PhD, and we found out that the whole soil structure is gone. You have problems with water holding capacity, water plant availability, and not so much with the nutrients, which was a bit surprising, but just with the physical properties, which are difficult to restore as well, because it takes so long for aggregates, soil aggregates to develop, and that's maybe the biggest problem.
Sorry to interrupt, but you were saying that you take out the clay content, and as we know, the clay is more desirable for soils to have, right?
Yeah, so in our the technology I was investigating, this worked with this chemical agent. So we did not take out the clay, the clay texture. We kept everything, but we needed to monitor also the leachate and had look for heavy metals and the chelating agent if they would go into the groundwater.
So when you say when you will take out the soil, how much meter we are talking about here?
It depends how deep the contamination goes. So if you are lucky, it's just contamination by dust. So the dust collects on the top and maybe does not penetrate the soil that deep. But then the dust also settles on agricultural fields. So you will have some plowing. So it's at least, 20 to 30 centimeters mixed. So you have to take out at least the 30 centimeters. And if you, it's so expensive. If you just calculate how many tons that would be for 1 hectare, I think it's not doable for agricultural fields. It's more for smaller scale approaches.
Mm-hmm. I see. And also you mentioned hyperaccumulator plants, which is a different discussion. So why these plants are specifically used for these soils contaminated by heavy metals?
So, hyperaccumulator plants, they are the ones used for the phytoextraction. So using plants for extracting heavy metals from contaminated soils. And they just developed on soils which were naturally rich in heavy metals. And also most of those hyperaccumulator plants accumulate nickel and are of the Brassica family. But there are also others which show higher accumulation of other heavy metals. And we can talk about hyperaccumulator plants if they really accumulate a lot. I mean, there are accumulator plants which actively accumulate. That means the upper part of the plant has a higher concentration compared to the roots. So somehow, with different processes, it happens so that heavy metals get transported through the plant into the stem. And hyperaccumulator plants, they accumulate quite a lot. So, but that also, it was just defined over several studies. And most commonly we talk about hyperaccumulator plants if they accumulate like more than 100 milligram per kilogram cadmium, for example, because cadmium is anyway very low concentrated in soil. 1,000 milligram per kilogram for copper, nickel, or lead. And sometimes we also talk about hyperaccumulator plants when they accumulate a lot of manganese or zinc, but then it's like over 1% of the whole biomass. If they have accumulated that much zinc or manganese, they're hyperaccumulators. And it makes sense if you have an area, for example, in Spain and Albania, there are really big trials with those plants, especially for nickel hyperaccumulation, and they are funded also by EU money. That's why they're working. But on the other hand, farmers are also subsidized when they do agriculture by the EU. So maybe in some areas it makes sense to subsidize farmers to do those hyperaccumulation just earn their living with hyperaccumulator plants, and then use the result or the harvest for regaining nickel or other metals from those plants.
So as I understood, we can use hyperaccumulator plants in the croplands. And I think mainly, I mean, they should only be used if they're not competing with other crop production, but there are areas where you have a quite high concentration of nickel, for example, and then that's a good alternative. But I mean, you could also try to do it. There are some projects, smaller projects in urban areas where you do that, but that's not for monetary reasons. And it also takes really long to get to values where you're under some legal thresholds or guidelines. So the problem of this method is it takes so long. Mm-hmm. But so the plants take up the heavy metals in their body, and to eat those, I don't think we can eat those plants, but what is done with these plants after that?
They are dried and then combusted. I mean, they can also be used for energy production then, but then they're burned, and the ash can be used as a ore for metallurgy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they're smelted and reused as metals for the industry.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned several strategies. First is washing the soil and getting out the heavy metals, and second is via plants, special plants. And are there any other strategies which are used to reduce or recover soil contamination by heavy metals?
I think I covered most of them. So stabilizing them in soil or extracting them using sometimes more, sometimes less force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. So you also mentioned that before we started this podcast, we were chatting, and you mentioned that you also use stable isotopes in your research. So could you talk a little bit more about how and why did you use isotopes?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, I'm working with this quite invasive washing technology to extract heavy metals, and we were interested not only in the heavy metal concentrations afterwards and if they're bioavailable or if they leach into the groundwater, but we also wanted to know about other functions which soil has and should be able to provide to be assumed high quality. And we can also talk about that, what quality means in context of soil. But one part would be the functioning of cycling nutrients, and that depends on a functioning microbial community. And one way to trace or to understand microbial community and nutrient cycling could be to use stable isotopes. So what are stable isotopes? Maybe we can have a look at the periodic table, and I can explain what they are and why they can be used in environmental research. So if we, for example, look at carbon, which is one of the most important elements for our living environment, we see that it has an atomic number of 6. That means its nucleus includes 6 protons and 6 neutrons. And this gives it its properties, or especially in the protons, because if there are not only 6 neutrons, but 7 or 8, it doesn't behave differently in nature, but it has a different mass. So there are all those elements with different amounts of neutrons, and all those are called then the isotope of the actual element. For carbon, there is the 12C carbon, which has 12 protons and neutrons, and there's the 13C carbon, which has 6 protons and 7 neutrons. But only the 12C exists quite abundantly. So 99% of our carbon in nature is 12C. But we can detect also the 13C and even enrich some substances with a lot of 13C and then measure it through metabolic processes. We can apply it onto the soil and see what, comes out as a leachate, for example, and then detect if there's any 13C in there. And then we know, okay, if there's 13C, a lot of 13C, it comes only from what we applied on top. You could do it with fertilizers, for example, to see where does the fertilizer go, how well is it used. And even if the fertilizer changes into, maybe it's metabolized and then it's not nitrogen, for example, anymore, but it's then NH4, which is a greenhouse gas. You could calculate the efficiency of your fertilizer and also, problems of over fertilization. So that's why we can use it as a tracer if we apply labels to the environment. Mm-hmm. But you could also just use all those isotopes which are already there, and that is called the natural abundance, because not only they're behaving the same in processes in nature, but they do that at a different rate. So if you imagine, for example, CO2 coming into a plant and then it's metabolized by the plant into sugar, this process prefers the lighter isotope. So it prefers the CO2, which has a 12C, and metabolizes much more of them. So the plant has then a higher ratio or a higher concentration of 12C compared to the air, because it discriminates the 13C. And if the plant then dies and goes into the soil and the microbes consume the plant, they also discriminate the heavier elements. And this is happening in a lot of processes in the environment. It also happens, for example, when it rains. So lighter oxygen, like the oxygen, which is lighter, is more. The lighter oxygen isotopes are transferred into rain from the gaseous phase before the heavier ones. And this means that if a cloud, for example, moves up a mountain, at first the lighter isotopes get rained down, and at a higher altitude, the heavier ones are raining down. So there are a lot of applications you could think of to use isotopes in environmental research. You can investigate water use efficiency by plants, exactly by what I described. Like plants, when they close their stomata, when it's hot, they use up much more of the CO2 and even the heavier isotopes. So you can look at plants, and if they used more of the heavier isotopes, they close their stomata or close it more efficiently. And this often happens in plants which are more water efficient. So there were a lot of studies done on that. But what I mentioned with the rain, you can also use to geolocate some things, from, where an animal drinks its water, or water, where water comes from, which is sourcing some rivers. Yeah. So you can do a lot of different things with that. And even, which is relevant for Austria as well, one of the most famous isotopic research topics was the Ötzi. Maybe you heard about it. There's like there's a human from prehistoric times, and he fell into a glacier and then was covered and recovered in the 20th century. And they took samples of his teeth and of his bones and analyzed the isotopes in there. I think in that case it was oxygen isotopes and strontium isotopes, and they were quite precise in locating where he came from, like where his home was. And that was super fascinating when I read that paper.
That's amazing. Yes, just imagine that one guy out of nowhere, you can track where the human is from, right?
Yeah.
Just looking at the skeleton.
Yeah. Or for example, they're testing also champagne. They want to know if it really comes from the Champagne region from Italy, or if it was cheaply produced somewhere else. And you can also do it with that.
Wow, that's so advanced technique. Mm-hmm. So you were using in your research the isotopes to track the cycle in the soil, and also how the soil microorganisms what they are doing actually, right? Mm-hmm. So as I know that when you track in isotopic compound, usually there is carbon 13 and nitrogen 15. So, and when you are using it, you know more about carbon and nitrogen cycle. I'm not sure if you studied it, did your own small research, but did you see how complex could be carbon and nitrogen cycle?
I mean, yeah, it's super complex. We just studied really small compartments, and we're not able to get every compartment and to study all the interactions because it's so diverse and the interactions are so complex. But what we did, we looked at several pools which were interesting to us, and we especially tried to identify if our microbial community changed after the washing, and we did that by extracting fatty acids and grouped them into different microorganism groups, and then had a look at the different products of nitrogen, like the ammonium pool or the nitrate pool, and also how much CO2 and N2O went out as like from soil respiration and we tried to track all of those streams of nitrogen and carbon. Yeah.
It's interesting that when we mention the danger, we mostly mention, it's dangerous for humans. But I was interested how it was influencing or dangerous to soil microorganisms, like what was happening to them.
I think we can say that heavy metals lead to changes in the structure of the microbial community. And because there's a stress, for example, like cadmium, there's just a metabolic stress on the microbes. And this deficit the natural community has can then be used by more tolerant microbes, and they just have a fitness benefit and will prevail in those soils. So there will be a change, and we don't always know if that's harmful to the, for example, carbon and nitrogen cycle or not. I mean, if they're that specialized to soils which are contaminated, probably they're not that good in metabolizing the soil organic matter as organisms which don't have adapted to such great stresses. So, and also a lot of papers suggest that this change in structure cannot be beneficiary for the CN cycle. I mean, always from our point of view of preventing greenhouse gases, for example. But I mean, there are real metabolic problems for non-tolerant organisms, and also very much depending on which heavy metal it is.
Mm-hmm. So you've been mentioning that we can stop later on what is soil quality. So could you elaborate a little bit on it? What is soil quality?
So obviously soil quality is like super subjective, and maybe a farmer would tell you, I don't know, a lot of food production and preserving the soil for future generations, also to produce agricultural crops on it. That's soil quality for for a farmer, for a consumer, it would be healthy soils. So no heavy metals or cheap food products. But yeah, for an environmentalist or a researcher, which is closely related mostly, they mostly view like the whole ecosystem, air, water, nutrient cycling, but also biomass production and biodiversity. So yeah, I think it's recognized that that high content of heavy metals are harmful to biodiversity or the microbial community. So we could say that high content of heavy metals is bad for soil quality. But yeah, there are also more. There is much more to it. I mean, it's not. There's no clear definition. There are only approaches and discussions about what is meant by soil quality. But mostly it is gathering around the soil organic matter and what that means for the soil ecosystem.
So to sum up all of what we said before, so the main source of the heavy metals are industries, minings, and are there any source? So mostly it's industries and minings. Like
industries, washing facilities. Like earlier, I think there are much heavier regulations now, but detergents are mostly organic, but they also they used to use also heavy metals, and which is in their wastewaters. Mining, smelting, heavy industries is really the biggest problem. But, so, I mean, not so much anymore. It was really what we are looking at are mostly old contaminations, at least in if we talk about Europe. I mean, there's still some countries burning a lot of coal, having mining industries which are not that heavily regulated. So it's still worldwide, it's still a big problem.
So it is dangerous. It influences human. It is very toxic, the heavy metals. And also, it's also not good for soil microorganisms. So soil microorganisms also doesn't like these heavy metals, right? So it looks like no one likes them except the plants, hyperaccumulator plants. They seem to like heavy metals, right?
I don't know if they like them, but since they adapted to it, it's their perfect niche. So yeah, I mean, from this point of view, they are liking them. It's their only niche.
Yeah. So again, it was very interesting to see that you've been also doing your small research, let's say a small research or project, your own gardening small project. How you came up with this idea and like how you started doing it. Could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so we have this urban garden in the 3rd district of Vienna, and it exists since 2015, and it was started by friends of mine. I think I was joining a half year later in the next season. But in the beginning, it was just a vacant lot in the middle of the city. Nobody used it except dog owners for getting their dogs outside, but it was not used by anybody. It was a former playground, and it was vandalized a couple of times, and then the city gave up on it. And years later, we asked the city if we could do some urban gardening there. And 6 years later, we have a beekeeper. We have a lot of raised beds. I think 25. We have an irrigation system. We have a kitchen, and we really did a lot of stuff and worked also with the technical university, with architects from there, and constructed some nice stuff on that ground.
So what was the motivation, or who came up with this idea, making a garden out of it?
It was a good friend of mine. I think he was more interested in creating a public space which was accessible by everyone, because usually also those gardens are, I don't know, you have to to be a member, then you get a key and you get one raised bed where you can plant your vegetables. But for us, we have one public space which can be used by everybody, and we also have a members only space, which is just the raised beds where they can grow their vegetables. But the beds are all shared by everyone, and you can, if you have your own ideas, you can take take care of one bed for a year or so, but the harvest is then shared with everyone. And this year also I took care of one bed and growing a lot of cucumbers at the moment.
Oh, okay. So it's a rats. They are rats. Mm-hmm.
No, rats. Yeah. How did you know that? Did we talk about this before? Yeah.
I just guessed from the cucumber. Okay.
No, but we're close to the Danube Channel and there are quite some rats. So we have to think of vegetables which are not that delicious to rats. So maybe, we gave up on tomatoes because they're too sweet, too delicious. Not only we like them. We have to deal with a lot of unexpected things as well as, the local fauna. So,
like, do you all collect money and start investing in it, everyone as they want to, or is there an amount, like shared amount, which you really need to invest in this project?
So our fees for our membership is just 10 euros a year. So we try to get as many people involved as we can, and then you can go everywhere. But the harvest is limited to people who pay 30 euros more, because we are using that money, like 30 euros a year, and we're using that money to buy seedlings, compost, everything we need to plant out our plants. So if we think that's quite cheap compared to other gardens, and
Yes, I think it was very interesting for me to talk with you about heavy metals. First of all, I think this is very interesting and important topic, especially for a person who comes from very arid parts of the country where lots of heavy metals. And it was essentially interesting to see that you've been, like yourself, doing that kind of project as gardening. And to sum up, I just have some general questions for you, if you could answer them. Right? Okay. So, as you know, I'm more into philosophy, and I believe that every scientist is a philosopher. So here we go. Does the future scare you?
Well, I think it does a bit. I think it's weird if we can. For me, I cannot think of only a positive future. So there are always some things which scare me, but I also learn to try not to think about things too hard that I have no direct influence over. So try to figure on the beautiful things which are also so abundant out there. So I mean, I'm always scared when I'm too long on Twitter, for example. But actually I try to be very positive.
As a scientist, are you scared of climate change?
Yes. Yes, I think, Also, I try to think of the positive things. Sometimes they're super nice. There's super good research done, new inventions presented, but I don't know if we can really turn this around. I hope so, and I try to contribute, but it doesn't look too good for us.
Yes. What advice would you give to your 10 years younger self?
Maybe start programming earlier. It's something I appreciated a lot during the last years, and you can be really, really diverse if you have that skill. So,
Okay, to be more specific, let's say you are speaking with 10 younger self. What programming code?
Probably Python.
Python.
Yeah. I mean, now I'm working mostly in R, but it's more flexible, Python. Yeah. And you really learn to program. In R, I'm mostly doing calculations and statistics, but not so much really coding, which you could also use in other fields. So I think with Python, you learn much more.
Exactly. I agree. I'm going to spoiler the future episodes, but I am thinking of coming up with something related with data science and data analysis, but I will talk about it more in the future. So listeners, please stay tuned if you want to know what's coming up next. So life is complex. What do you think about it?
I think I kind of like that life is complex, and I think we have to accept that and accept that we don't know everything. And I think you can learn a lot when you or improve your life a lot if you accept that everything is a bit ambiguous. So nothing is good or bad. And sometimes you have to make bad decisions to which are the right ones, maybe. Yeah, and that's nothing you have to think about your whole life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But what's the difference with giving up and also accepting that life is complex? How do you think?
I think you can either accept that it's complex and try to understand the part you're comfortable with, because you will never understand everything, and accept your limits, or you say it's too complex and I don't even try to understand anything. And I think the second one is definitely worse. Mm-hmm. And yeah, sometimes when I talk to people about it and they have the one or the other opinion, yeah, I kind of feel when people gave up on understanding the complexity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do think that what you said is quite true, because sometimes we see so many opportunities and we want to catch up all of them, but you cannot focus in multiple fields. So you really need to choose one, right? Mm-hmm. Exactly. What is the meaning of life?
Yeah, really difficult. But I thought about it, and if this wouldn't be like an auditive medium, I would maybe answer with a meme. Maybe you've seen it online. It's like a sad and a happy face of two people sitting in a bus. One is looking outside. They're in the same bus. One is looking outside the one window where it's a beautiful landscape, and the other one is looking against a wall and is super sad. And over the meme, it's written, "Life has no meaning." So you could either embrace it and say, "I can make up my own meaning, and it's beautiful. There's nothing like guiding our hands," or you are kind of, I don't know, sad that there is some meaning and there is maybe a guiding hand, but why is the world so bad sometimes, and why are so many bad things happen? So I think we would make up our own meaning. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe I can find the meme and put it if I find it. Yeah. So thank you so much for being here today and making some time and making this happen. I appreciate it. And thank you for sharing with your knowledge and being part of sharing the knowledge and answering the questions sincerely. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really interesting and a new experience for me as well. And yeah, thanks a lot.
Yes. So you can find Christoph Noller's online on the descriptions below. And if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. So bye.